Warning: the podcast you're about to listen to may contain graphic descriptions of violent assaults, murder, and adult language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Season 3 of the Murder Police Podcast. I am Wendy.
And I'm David. And welcome, everybody. That we moved away from Seasons 1 and 2, and we're into Season 3. And today we have a special treat on what's releasing today. We said that in Season 3 we're going to start expanding a little bit and moving into different topics and different people that are part of the Murder Police system. And we've got a super treat for everybody today. I've heard a million times or seen people quoted when they see a trial go is they always saying, well, if I was on the jury, I'd do that. Or if I was on the jury, I'd say this. Or that person would have got this. And that's interesting. But the reality of it is, not too many people get to serve on murder trial juries.
Yeah, and we were fortunate enough to have a capital murder juror with us, Miss Jayne Ford. She came and shared a story on a case that took place in Lexington, Kentucky a few years back. And it was really interesting to hear what goes into that, the stress, the anxieties at some points that come along with it, and how jurors get along or don't get along or agree or not. It was really eye-opening to hear that whole process, especially for me, who's never served on a jury.
Well, and for me too, because I've been on the other side of it. And one of the things I found that it was extremely educational, because a lot of things I guessed when I was on the stand, she kind of affirmed. And then I learned a lot about what goes on. But what's really good is Jayne is very well spoken about this. And, it's a lot like the investigators when they talk about a case. Jayne has all these details like it happened yesterday. It left an impression on her that great. And you're right too. The amount of responsibility on this and the weight on those jurors' shoulders is incredible. A capital case, by the way, is a case where the death penalty is on the table. So the crime was bad enough and had the aggravators in Kentucky to where the jury would consider the death penalty. And I can't imagine on that level of being called in. And Jayne said it great during the interview here where she says, we're supposed to make judgments about people we don't know and have never met. And I thought, wow, that summed it up.
It really did. And they certainly had their work cut out for them, because there was a lot of back and forth there with the attorneys and just it. I encourage you to listen to that. If
people are listening now, you're getting the first episode is watch Thursday, 2 days from now, and you'll get the second episode. Now, I will say that as interesting as it is, and it is interesting, is the true crime fanatics that are out there begging for cases. Those aren't stopping. Is that we've got some really neat stuff that I'm not even going to hint to right now, because what's going to follow pretty shortly is another mini-series on an incredible crime with a couple of incredible investigators. So don't worry about that.
I think we should give the listeners a hint of the case, of what they can look forward to.
Okay, well.
So listeners, I'll just go ahead and let you know that this case is so incredible. It's sad. It's horrible. But we did have two really awesome detectives in here who worked that case. One of them is a detective that has been on our show before, that has worked a few cases that we've recorded, Detective Chris Schoonover, with another awesome detective that will be joining him, Detective Rob Wilson. And that is going to be on the 2013 murder of Alex Johnson. And that's all I will say about that. So if you are one to look ahead, go ahead and look up that 2013 murder, Google it, and you will find on Mr. Alex Johnson. It was a crazy case, wasn't it?
It was. But you know what? Again, what we're going to offer and people are going to find is hang on tight, because these two are really going to take you into areas, because it's been covered in different venues before. One of them, quite frankly, that was done real well was by Kristen Flum, and she did a podcast series called Taking Alex. So when they're researching this one, I would strongly recommend taking a peek and a listen at that one. Speaking of other podcasts, I've got to give a shout out to one of my favorite ones that I stumbled across called The 13th Floor. What that is it's actually done by a podcaster here in Kentucky who works with a couple in Atlanta. Your hosts on this one are Cece, Alex, and James. And they discuss the paranormal and the unusual. That's why they call it the 13th floor. And what's really neat is they take suggestions from the audience. They spend a week researching those things and report out on them. And the two things I'll tell you you'll walk away from is you'll feel smarter because of the details they bring to this stuff, and you'll smile. It's fantastic. So to find them, it's just simply the 13th Floor Podcast. They're at 13thfloorpodcast.com. And just to make sure you get it right, it's the 13th floorpodcast.com. With that, let's go ahead and get into the show and listen to the interview with Jayne.
And always thanks for listening to the Murder Police Podcast. Hello, listeners. Thank you for joining us at the Murder Police Podcast. Today, we have Miss Jayne Ford with us, and we are so excited to hear from Miss Jayne. This is a first-time interview like this we have done. Jayne served as a juror in a 2005 murder case that took place here in Lexington. So, Jayne, thank you for joining David and I.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here. This is a great opportunity to be able to tell a different perspective of a murder case.
I'm really excited. I've wanted to do this for a while because I think the audience needs to hear what it's like to do that. A lot of people, when they see a murder case get put down in the news, like when it's done with trial, they may say things like the system failed or what about that jury? And the most common thing you hear people say is, well, if I'd been on that jury. Well, the reality is not that many people get the opportunity, and I'm going to call it an opportunity to be on a jury because it's an obligation once you get called, and we'll talk about that some more. So I'm excited to have you to. I want to hear more about what it's like with the perspective you get from times when I testified. and I know it wasn't the same case, but I've always been interested in how we affect juries when we're up on the stand and whatnot. So we'll get into that pretty deep. But thank you for coming today. I'm real excited.
Thank you.
Well, Jayne, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I am originally from Atlanta. I grew up there, but actually came up here to Kentucky. I went to college at EKU. I graduated with a degree in broadcasting, which at the time was not very common. Most schools had print journalism, and I was interested in broadcast journalism. So that's why I came up here. And then I graduated and ironically ended up back in Atlanta with a job at CNN, Cable News Network. And I was one of the first 1,000 employees actually at CNN. My badge says number 905.
Wow.
And I worked there for about 22 years.
What did you do at CNN? Because that's fascinating, actually.
Well, being there in the early days, you started out what they call your entry-level position. And this shows you how long ago this was. You actually took physical videotape and you spliced it from when it got thin. You put it back together with the tape and rewound it so they could record more stories on it. Then from there, you kind of worked your way up to where you floor directed, showed the anchors the cameras to look into. You ran a teleprompter, which again in those days was an actual conveyor belt where you stacked scripts on top of each other. And then you floor directed, which was where you tell the anchors which camera to look into if you're going to break, coming out of a break and stuff like that. After you do that for a while, you have an opportunity to go a technical or editorial. And I went the technical route, which again, this was back in the 80s, so not very technical. But I worked as what was called the character generator, which is basically your words that you see below the names, the cities, the sports scores, weather, temperatures. And I did that for several years. And then I became the graphics coordinator. At that point, we were a little more technical, if you can say, and we were getting a little more respect at CNN for doing big stories, big cases. Well, I just happened to be the graphics coordinator when the O.J. Simpson came along. And we covered that case for almost 10 months. So I was the graphics coordinator for that, on the phone every day with a producer from L.A. This is our witnesses. This is who we're going to have. These are our exhibits we're going to have for graphics of evidence and stuff. So I did things like that. You also are on the phone with the producers from the White House when you're doing a press conference with the president or any type of Senate hearings. So you're making sure that the graphics information gets on air correctly.
It's neat. That's a piece of American history right there.
That is.
That is kind of cool, especially with the technology as it was back then. There's a lot of people listening probably don't know what videotape is or I always
or splicing.
Exactly.
Yeah. That does show my age.
Yeah, I always tell people when I teach on campus at colleges, I can't say things like the record skipped or put a quarter on a tone arm because they have no idea what that is. That's fascinating and pretty cool. So what we're going to talk about today, though, is the opportunity that you eventually came to when you were here. about getting seated on a jury for a murder trial, which again, I think is going to be critical to the listenership as far as hearing how that works. But when this started, do you remember how you were selected to be on a jury? How did that work?
Yes. Well, one day I just happened to get a notice in the mail that said I was being selected for jury duty. And I know everybody's probably heard stories like, oh my gosh, jury duty. Well, I'll get out of it. I know I'll say this or this won't happen. And well, actually, what kind of made it a little interesting was that at the time I was about 8 months pregnant with my daughter. So the date that I was supposed to report was the week of my due date. So I knew I couldn't do it. So I called my doctor, down at the courthouse and said, well, this is, what's happening. I'm not really trying to get out of this. But they said, well, just send a note. So we sent the note that went through and they sent me you don't have to report. You're not going to be in trouble. And I thought, well, okay, well, forget about that. Well, my daughter was about 7 or 8 months old. Well, I got the notice again. So I figured, well, now I have to do it. So I went down there the first day. And as you know, David, that when you go down there, you're in this huge room with several hundred people and you have a jury number and you listen for the numbers to be called or not called. And if your numbers are not called, then you still sit there and you're waiting. And then the crowd gets a little smaller and a little smaller. And then I guess the attorneys are talking with people and they whittle it down a little more. And then a couple of hours more go by. Then it's like, okay, it's lunch. Well, you got to come back and we're going to do some more. This process went on for almost 2 days. And after about 2 days, there was about 30 of us left. And then at that point, they took us from the very large room we were in and walked us through this labyrinth of hallways. I had no idea where it was because there's no windows. There's no frame of reference. And you sit in a smaller conference room and then a bailiff comes to get you and they say, come with me. If you have no idea what's going on, what's next, where you're going or anything. So you walk through a door and walk into the actual courtroom. And you're just kind of, oh my gosh, and you see a judge sitting there and you see attorneys on the other side. And you're like, oh my gosh, wow.
It gets real.
Yeah. It is really.
I imagine I would be thinking, oh my gosh, am I in trouble? They brought me in through this back way and there sits the judge.
Right. And everybody's looking at you and they're looking at your forms that you filled out and they're asking you questions based on that and looking at you. And the attorneys are looking at you and they're writing notes and looking at you. And then I just happened to notice, I looked over to one side of the one table and I saw what ended up being the defendant because he was shackled at the ankles.
That's usually, we'd call that a clue.
Yeah, I would say, yeah. But you don't know that at first. You just see a guy who's in a decent looking shirt and pants and then you look at that. And then I noticed he was also shackled, at the table with his wrists. So that was kind of scary.
Yeah, taking back just a couple of things I don't want to glaze over is first, thanks for serving on the jury. I think that obviously the first time you got called, you had what I'd say is a very legitimate excuse for not being there. Mm-hmm. And they don't want to have somebody who has to stop in the process to do that. And you were close to that.
Right.
Because there are people who when they get those notices, they really get angry. Or and I've always said that that's an obligation. One, you're going to learn something. You probably learned a lot that we're going to hear about in the next few minutes, starting just with those basic things. But it's always aggravated me to see people try to duck out on that or to come up with a feigned excuse. Do you remember anybody trying that when you were in there? Did anybody produce something to the judge and the judge decline them? Or
well, a couple of people did say, I can't do this. I've got to work. And my employer is not very, generous with time off. And I mean, I know you get some very small stipend of jury. It's like $12 a day. I can't remember. But a lot of people are like, I just can't do it. And I can't commit. Or, they would ask other questions. Like I was saying, when I went into the jury or into the room with the judge, they ask you, can you commit to at least maybe a couple of weeks? Because this trial could last that long. And they also ask you, what are your feelings on the death penalty?
Also, we're at a capital case then, right?
Yes.
Oh, that adds quite a bit to it.
Right. So a lot of people said, well, I'm totally against it, or I'm for it. And people were making notes and things. And so a lot of people are just like, I can't do it. So I think some people got struck that way. And that's how we got down to about 20 maybe at that point.
Yeah, that takes me back to this, that people wonder, well, how do you get on a list? And in Kentucky, I did a little bit of research before we sat down because it had been so long since I looked at it. But the administrative office of the courts keeps a thing called a master list, and they develop that based off of people who file individual tax returns and people who have driver's licenses and people that are registered voters. And several years ago, it was limited to driver's licenses and voter registration, which was probably excluding people because you couldn't cull the list. You couldn't clean it up, and people didn't update their material, their voter registration or their license. And about the time that you went into court is when they added the individual tax return, which was probably smart, because I think you've got to, if you're going to get a jury of your peers, you got to have a big pool to go from. So that's where that came from, and that too. And when you're talking about the strikes, that's what a lot of people don't understand, and maybe they see it in TVs, but when it comes to that, it's called voir dire, and which is French for speak the truth. And what it is that's how they whittle the jury down, is that questions about things like how you stand on it. I've always joked that if you want to get a jury duty, you just go in there like the old TV show and say, give them a fair trial and then convict them. And then they may let you out. The other way to almost never get on a jury is to be a cop.
Right.
And because I've been called too. And I remember I was in that big room and they were naming cases, they were naming people, and every time they named an officer that was involved, I'd put my hand up.
You knew them.
Yeah, and exactly. And the judge finally stops, and she goes, well, you put your hand up every time. And I said, well, they've all worked with me at some point, so you don't last long. As a matter of fact, I remember I had a sexual assault trial, and I came into the courtroom. I got sworn in, sat in a stand, turned my chair to the jury and looked, and there was an active sergeant from the police department sitting on the jury, Eric Garner. And I looked at him kind of like, and we can't do this because there's no visual, but I kind of furrowed my brow and I'm like, kind of gave him that look like, why are you here? And he kind of put his hands out and he goes, I don't know. And went on with the trial. And I think later they tried to challenge that, but the judge said, you saw the form, you knew that he was an active cop, but that's so rare that they'll have us in there. But on that voir dire, the way that works is that each side can challenge somebody on a jury.
Right.
For a certain number, they have to give a reason, and a certain number they don't. Do you remember some of the other questions that they asked you during voir dire? Because a lot of people don't realize this goes on.
Right. Well, not only did they ask about your opinion on the death penalty, but one of the odd questions I thought was why they asked this was, what kind of bumper stickers do you have on your car?
Wow. Yeah, I guess they're going to
see if you support some, out there political group or some other rights group or something, but I thought that was a little strange.
Yeah, trying to dig and see if you have some biases or something they can point to. That's pretty interesting, because I know their goal too is of course both sides are trying to get an impartial jury, and they want that, but at the same time they're already building a rapport with everybody in that box too, and they're trying to develop a relationship. Also, it's not uncommon for them to start laying out their case theory at that time very gently to kind of feel through to see how you respond to that. And there's actually people, if people want to get involved in the justice system, there's actually professional people that actually help select juries, which is unique. On high profile cases, you'll see that where they're contracted to come in and they do more of a study of the human psyche, I think.
Right. Wasn't that what Dr. Phil did with Oprah?
I think so.
When she was on trial for the Texas Meat Council or something? I
think so. Yeah, exactly. You pay somebody that comes in and just like having a marketing executive. So good stuff. But thanks for serving, because that's a big deal that people try to get away from.
Yeah. And one other thing I wanted to add about, you were talking about people that was trying to get out. There was one guy on the jury, he obviously didn't make it, that they were asking him some of the basic questions. And he said, well, I can tell you right now, I'm not going to do this, and I ain't interested. I mean, he was really kind of smart aleck. And the judge said, oh, really? Why is that? And he says, because I think you're a jerk.
Yeah,
to the judge.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, they swiftly got him out of the room.
He's lucky he went home. You don't play in those rooms. You do not play in those rooms. He's lucky he went home. He could have done a night in the smokehouse at a goose cow for that remark. And I've seen people stay overnight for less than that. So he was a very fortunate person. Did you have something that you were going to?
No, I was just going to say what you said. Thank you for doing that. I'm serving on the jury duty. As much as a crime enthusiast as I am, I've never been selected. And I always thought if I got selected, I would want to be those that would want to keep coming back.
Right.
Like, can I get another turn?
I think they make you wait a couple of years.
I think they call that a job, don't they?
Yeah, probably a job.
Yeah, I think so.
Exactly.
But thank you. That's really interesting. And yeah, I agree. Like I just said before, I would have been nervous too. You walk in and you see the judge. My thought, I always err on the side of cautious thinking, nervous Nelly, if you will. I would have been thinking that was a ploy to get me in here. I'm in trouble for something.
Right, because they didn't tell you where you were going. And you just...
And then there's everyone when you walk in the room. I guess I would have had the same shock factor you had when you walk in and see the defendant sitting there shackled. Because like you, I would have probably thought, well, it's just lawyers sitting there doing the voir dire or whatever they're in there to do. I wouldn't have thought that this is right now they're doing this. So yeah, I can imagine the shock that must have been in your eyes. But thank you for serving on that.
Did the defendant make a lot of eye contact with you or other people on the jury?
Oh, yes. That was something I was going to bring up, but I'm glad you asked that. He did. And he actually, I want to say there were 5 women on the jury. And we talked about this after the fact because, you're not allowed to talk about things before you go to deliberations. But a lot of the women felt, and I knew because he looked at me a lot and he winked and kind of gave you a little smile. And you were just totally creeped out by that.
Yeah, I'm going to say for sure, but I would imagine if I was a defense attorney, I would counsel and coach them on trying to build a rapport visually. That might have been excessive, clearly, if it offended you.
Right.
But there's so much that goes into this that people don't know. Everything from the way they dress and everything. But part of that probably was that he might have just exceeded that boundary a little more and went a little further than they wanted. But I know I'd try that. Well, good deal. We've interrupted you a little bit, I think, and taken you out of it. But so you're in the room and you're down to that like 30 or so.
Right.
Continue with how that went.
From there, after and we all went through that questioning process in the courtroom. They took us back to that conference room. We sat there for about 20 minutes, and then they said, "Okay, jury number," and they called numbers, and they said, "If I called your number, come with me. If I didn't, you're free to go." I'm like, "Oh man." They called my number, so here I am, down to about the last 15. Then we went into this hallway, and the attorneys were there, and they were talking and looking at numbers, and they started, crossing things off and kind of whispering. And then all of a sudden they said, "Okay, if we call your number, you will be on the jury. Here in this box over here on this table is a pad, pencil. You have 30 minutes to use the restroom, call your family, tell them you've been picked, and we're going to start." Like, okay, wow. And I'm like, okay, I'm not going to get picked. I'm not going to get picked. Second number they called was me.
No.
So like, well, guess I know what I'm doing for the next couple of weeks.
Like waiting to get picked for dodgeball.
Right.
That last
You're the last kid standing.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. But I was very fortunate that I had my mother-in-law came, and she helped to take care of my daughter because my husband was working. And so what are you going to do with an infant?
And there you go. It's moving 30 minutes. And again, it's not something where it's like, okay, next Tuesday at noon we'll start. It's like, okay, hang on tight. The ride's getting going. And I know from our perspective, yes, they moved. Is that when they hit the starter pistol and said, we're going, they went. Right.
So they picked the jury and the 2 alternates, and they let the other couple people go. And that's what we did. Restroom, phone, and they walk you in the courtroom, and you're sitting down, and boom, we're starting.
Oh, wow. Well, tell us about that. Tell us how it opened up and take us through what that's like, what you hear and what you saw.
Well, the prosecuting attorney started with a statement of saying, this is a case. It's very serious. It's a murder, sodomy case. We want to show that this defendant is guilty, and we will show you why he is guilty. And then the defense attorney got up and said, this is someone who has been essentially identified wrongly. And we're going to show you why he is not guilty. And it is up to you to decide.
Pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's straightforward. And again, when we're in those cases, we're not allowed in the room at that time. We wait and we wait and we wait out in the hall. So we don't see that part, is we're sequestered out. So,
and then the one thing that one of the attorneys did say for the prosecution was, and that's something I think that stuck with me, and it sticks with me even when I watch other, quote, true crime stories, or you hear about other things. You have to use your common sense. You have to use your common sense. And as it says, you have to convict, and look at the evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. And then you question, well, what's reasonable for some people? Is this reasonable to me, but not to you? How are we going to come to an agreement one way or the other at the end of this trial? And that stuff, you just really start thinking at that point.
Yeah, because we hear that term all the time, right? And now it has meaning. Did they probably didn't talk a lot about that term in the beginning, though, did they?
No.
They waited till we'll get to the end in a minute. But
in closing.
Yeah, for sure. But that's an interesting concept, is that beyond a reasonable doubt. And I like the way you threw in the word common sense, because that gets lost in that. As a lot of people think it's like the ultimate doubt. And some people's minds will really go to strange places, that everything just short of an alien could have landed and did it. And we'd have no proof of that, right? But circumstantially it happened. Common sense plays a big role in this.
Right.
So I'm glad they talked about that, because I've heard stories of what that's like in a jury room if common sense kind of takes a hike and goes on vacation for a while. So so they do the opening. Everybody's pretty straightforward. They're kind of laying where they're going to take you in that. Okay.
Yes, they're talking about the evidence that they will present, and that you'll see why, say on the prosecution said, why he is guilty. We feel that we have enough evidence and exhibits to show you that this will result in a conviction.
Great. And then where's it go from there? Do you take lunch, or did they go right in?
No, they did at least 2 witnesses before we had a lunch break.
Yeah. Who called the witnesses first? Do you remember?
Prosecution.
Yep. Good deal. So tell us about that when those witnesses sat down. Like your impressions on that. Like, were there things when you watched the witnesses that either led to their credibility, or were there things that detracted from their credibility? Did you get a row from that from listening to them?
It was, I'm trying to think, it was so, you're putting yourself so focused on, okay, what they're saying, and are they presenting it in a way that you understand it, that it's not too over your head. And what I took away from a lot of it when the police detectives came up to testify was that you realize how much time is spent on one case. When you're watching the news at night, you may see 30 seconds of a crime scene, and you see the tape up and people walking around, and that's all you really see. But what they got into was, once they were called initially, and the detectives came and photographs were taken, evidence was taken, that it was almost 2 days of evidence gathering.
Oh, yeah. And when we summarize, it feels a lot faster than that. So
right.
And one thing you said that to point out too is being able to understand them and to hear it in terms that you'd understand. So for our would-be people who are out there that are listening to this that might get into the business one day, is take that to heart and don't forget that. Is communicate with people. Don't talk down to them. Don't use jargon. That was a thing that I never liked when people do. And some people, I think, just in the policing business do that, as they start rolling things off their tongue that nobody in that room understands, instead of just simply saying what you saw. So for people listening that are going to do this, that's an important thing to communicate with these people clearly. So So I guess the first witnesses were probably on the law enforcement side, right? Did they bring up any, without naming anybody, did they bring any family members of the victim to talk about the victim at all in the beginning?
Not really at the beginning. That was more at the end.
Okay.
That the family of the victim and family and, quote, friends of the defendant both came in to testify about their character.
But it was probably during sentencing. Right. Yeah. Probably when we.
Yes.
Yeah. Probably. Because we've talked about that on here, how you have that sentencing phase.
Right. So there wasn't much family.
Gotcha.
In the actual trial.
Well, once they got through with the police, because we kind of generally know what to expect on them. Well, let's go back on that. when the prosecution was done questioning, did the defense cross-examine, as we would say, those police?
Yes, definitely. As far as, well, why did you take this type of evidence, but you didn't look for this? Or, well, are you sure that this is what this said? Just because it says it on this piece of paper, what does that really mean? This is just paper. Like one of the facts in the case was that they had I guess the medical examiner had testified that the chances of the defendant's DNA being there was like a 1 and a number I'd never heard before, 16 quadrillion chance that it was him as opposed to somebody else.
Yeah.
Well, the defense was like, well, that's a number, but did you do this test? Trying to get you to look at something else and say, well, they didn't really do their job on this particular thing.
Well, that's a common tactic, right? I mean, you'll see that for sure.
Well, they want to create that reasonable doubt we were talking about.
Exactly.
Well, more than that, too, to be honest with you, is they're kind of hoping for unreasonable doubt. I mean, there again, we talked about the common sense thing. If I can walk you down that road, because the trick is I only need one person in that jury room to bite on that and run with it, and we're back on another trial or not guilty. So it's pretty important.
Well, can we get into the premise of what this case even was without mentioning names or going into too many details?
Right.
Did you know this was going to be a murder case when you went in?
Absolutely not.
So you walk in and you see the defendant shackled. You don't know if it's a DUI or an unpaid car fine or whatever it could be. So at what point did you learn that this was in fact a murder case?
Oh, well, to back up a little bit, when we went into that room with the 20 or 30 of us, when we all came in individually, that's when we sat down, and that's when the judge looked at us and said, I want you to realize this is at least a 2-week commitment, and this is a death penalty case. So she did say that at that point.
So you knew. So you knew. So then I guess they start getting into the details of that case, of what happened that particular day or night. Can you give us a little bit of what this case even was?
It was a murder case that occurred here in Lexington in 2005. It was a woman that was murdered. The defendant was accused of strangling her and sodomizing her. She died, according to the medical examiner, suffocation by strangulation. And then we also had a separate charge of sodomy. And she did have head injuries as well.
When the judge mentioned not only it was a murder case, but a capital murder case, which in Kentucky means the death penalty could apply, what did that feel like to sit in that room and have that dropped in your lap? Did you get an emotional response to that?
I did. I think it made my heart just race at that point, because you've got all these strangers looking at you and thinking, is this person going to make the right decision for my client? You know? And then you also are thinking, and I thought about this a lot during the trial and even afterwards, you're determining the future of this man's life, and you're affecting not only him, his family, but the victim, her family. So there's a lot of people's lives at stake in their future, and there's a lot riding on that decision. So that's why you want to ultimately make sure, obviously, you're doing the right thing based on the evidence that you get, that you are making the right decision.
An incredible responsibility. I can't, never been there, but I know that's how I would look at it. And again, I love doing this because people from the outside that have never done it, I think they make assumptions. Well, I would do this or I would do that. And I think until you've been saddled with that responsibility and that accountability, I don't think it's fair for people to second guess. I've never liked second guessing juries anyway. Even when I didn't really agree with what they did, that's the system we have, and you accept with what they come up with. So well, good deal. Moving forward, so we've got the first witnesses. They've crossed them. Let me ask you this: when did you start to get impressions on how you felt about the prosecuting attorney and the defense attorneys on how they handled people? I guess what I'm getting at, did their character make you want to believe them more or not believe them, or did you get frustrated with some of the tactics from time to time, or how did it feel from the jurors' perspective?
As far as the prosecution, I mean, they were very calming in the way they spoke, presented things very methodically, did not say, you have to see this, you need to see this. It was, this is what we have, This is how I present this, etc. And then we felt, again, in deliberations, that we felt that the defense attorney was very, just kind of would jump on certain things and say, well, you need to look at this, or, why did you have to look at why they didn't do this? They're not doing their job. You need to see this because of my client. And there was actually, getting towards the end, in closing arguments, where we were allowed to know that the defendant had some prior misdemeanor convictions, but we were not allowed to know anything else about him, which turns out, we found out after the fact, that he actually had a pending rape arrest. The defense attorney came to us and said, well, you have to see that he is not a bad man. Yes, he's had some shoplifting and he's written a few bad checks, but that's because he's trying to provide for his family. He is not, and this was something I do remember the defense attorney saying, he is not a man who takes planes and crashes them into the side of buildings.
Yeah, that's on the wake of 9/11.
Yeah.
That's a stretch. Okay, I hadn't heard that one. But I do like the thing about taking care of your family, because I know when we wanted a boat, I just started shoplifting myself, and that way I figured whatever money I saved about shoplifting, we could apply to the boat.
Goes in our pocket,
right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a common thing. That's just the way I look at it. So, yeah, but again, their whole thing is they've got to be passionate. Did you ever get frustrated with that tactic? Did it ever look like it went over the edge, or?
Yes, I would say we did. And again, in deliberations, we talked about that. Was like, wow, it just, it was really trying to drive that point of, I know that's their job, is to, like you said, create that little bit of doubt, but it was just so much. And there was so much testimony against him from the prosecution side that the evidence was, you were seeing how this was going. And it felt uncomfortable to be kind of, I don't want to say we weren't bullied, but just the way they presented it from the defense point, to just shove it down your throat.
That's an interesting perspective. So I guess if attorneys are listening, maybe take note on that.
Don't do that. They don't like it.
Exactly. And I've always suspected that, is that I know from times when I've been crossed, is that if it ever left, because we understood it was going to be aggressive, it had to be, and we understood if you didn't have your material together, you had that coming. That was. You if you're not ready, you don't belong up there doing that. So you knew that if you had something on there. But every now and then I could pick up that if they really went hard like that, and I was watching the jury, you could almost watch the head start to shake, the eyes roll, the impatience come up. And I thought, man, I don't think you're doing your client any favors. I mean, I could really sense that if I could grab you by the ear right now, we're not agreeing with what we're doing today, I'd tell you, hey, back off. Not because I'm having a rough day of it, but I think the best insult you can give an attorney is when if they argue with you outside the courtroom, is to look at one and say, I think you've put more people in prison than I have. and because of the fact that there's a fine line, and being able to read the people in a jury, I think that's important. But I can tell people that's not always the case, though.
Right.
Is that I've been in trial with some people that are fantastic attorneys. Fantastic. And when they're questioning you and they're crossing, you know exactly where they're going. And you're like, I would go the same way. Fran Root said in an episode not too long ago.
That most of his friends were defense attorneys.
Exactly.
I remember him saying that.
I think TV and movies, once again, makes it look like everybody hates each other, but you grow an immense amount of respect for these people. And, and even when they lean in hard, you've got to have an appreciation for that passion, is they're advocating for those people. But the law of diminishing returns is in there somewhere too. So interesting stuff. Now, with these witnesses, was there anything that a witness could do that would start to, from a juror perspective, lose credibility? Is there anything they could say, or the way they'd act, or?
Not that I could think of, because I remember when the police were testifying that they had notebooks and notebooks of documentation. When they were asked a specific question, they'd say, let me refer to my notes, please. They'd go through and look and look and look and find that answer. So you felt that they were very well prepared. So there wasn't really anything I can see that would dismiss credibility.
Good deal. And who was the lead detective? Do you remember?
It was Bill Brislin.
Oh, Bill. Yeah, great. We hope we get Bill back on again. Bill's fantastic.
I just hope he didn't cry.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, Bill.
No, he was very professional. And
No,
ended up-
he is. Yeah, he's. I hope we get him back again. He was a joy to work with for sure.
Yeah, he was great. He sidebar here. He's now gone back into policing as a patrolman after 20 years of policing, and now he's gone back to be a patrolman. So he really loves policing, and you can tell his heart's in it.
Oh, yeah. And he's a wonderful guy. We got to know him very well after the trial through what we're going to talk about later.
Yeah, definitely. And for our listeners, without being too obscure on it, if you want to hear him, listen to the 5 episodes on the murder of Umi Southworth, and you're in for a treat. Yeah, that was one of our favorite ones to put together because of the fact that 2 other detectives were in the studio and did that with him. That was fantastic stuff. Well, let's move then from the police. Did the defense and themselves, did they start to put on witnesses when it switched over to their opportunity?
Hey, you know there's more to the story, so go download the next episode like the true crime fan that you are.
The Murder Police podcast is hosted by Wendy and David Lyons and was created to honor the lives of crime victims so their names are never forgotten. It is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lyons. The Murder Police podcast can be found on your favorite Apple or Android podcast platform, as well as at murderpolicepodcast.com, which is our website, and it has show notes for imagery and audio and video files related to the cases you're going to hear. We are also on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, LinkedIn, and YouTube, which has closed caption available for those that are hearing impaired. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe for more and give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or wherever you download your podcast from. Subscribe to the Murder Police podcast and set your player to automatically download new episodes so you get the new ones as soon as they drop. And please tell your friends. Lock it down, Judy.